thank you very, very much for the nice introduction, and let me thank the sponsors of today's event. This many people who would come to an event on a day like this when you could be outside, I can't tell you how grateful that makes me, because we know that summer is coming to an end, and we just like to grab every moment of sunshine that we can before the Oregon winter rain set in. So I'm particularly appreciative, and I want to thank the church for making its facility available, and I know that it always takes extra work when you have something extra in the church, so thank you very much for that. I am a Methodist by background, and so it feels right at home in here. So I want to read to you today from my book, but before I do that, I want to just say to you, when people found out I was writing a book, they assumed it was a book about politics. That's what politicians do. They write books about their career and tell you how wonderful they were. And when people found out it was a book on death and grieving, I think they were really shocked. It was not where people expected me to go. This book took about 5 years in my spare time. I was working full-time back at Harvard when I started writing the book, and it took about 5 years in my spare time to write it. A lot of it was written on train trips and plane rides when I had time and there was nobody there to ring the telephone and talk to me, so I could really focus on the book. I sort of cried myself across America, train and plane, because this was a very emotional journey to write this book for me. It was part of my path through grieving and healing, and I've always felt, now that it's finished, that I was really aided by each new sentence and each new paragraph I wrote. It was a way to help me get through the process. So I did, in fact, weep my way through this book, and I would like to tell you now that because I know the book so well, I know every sentence, I wrote and rewrote, re-edited, and by the time I finished that, I felt like I knew each sentence so well that I basically wrung all the emotion out of those sentences. I wish I could tell you that were true. It's not. I'd like to be able to report that I can pick up this book and read any place in this book, no matter how emotional it is, and get through it absolutely tear-free. Truth is, sometimes I can't. It's a little bit hard to keep my emotions in check when I relive the pain of this process. Now, I have a wonderful friend who suggested to me that maybe what I needed to do was simply read from parts that were not so emotional that I could read without weeping. And so I said, I'm going to read the table of contents to you. That's the only place I'm absolutely assured I can read. And sometime I do fine and sometime I don't. And the other thing I will tell you, most of the chapters in the book I can get through pretty well now. The one I can't read in public most of the time, and I have to be very careful, is the hospice chapter. I couldn't figure out why that was. I can read these direct descriptions of Frank's death, and I can read all of this other really painful things in the book, but every time I got to the hospice chapter, I couldn't get by the first page. And a friend of mine suggested that maybe the difference was that the other chapters were about Frank. This chapter was about me. The other chapters, I'd worked through my grief with the writing. The chapter that dealt with me personally, in a way, was the one that I may not have worked yet. You see, she said that may be why you have a problem. So in spite of all the hospice people who are here today, I haven't read for 6 weeks. I took a little vacation from reading and book marketing for a while, and I knew when I came today that this wasn't a day for me to read from the hospice chapter, but I know each of you who buy the book or who have read the book understand that the hospice chapter was really one of the major reasons I wrote the book. It is the longest chapter in the book, and it is one of the 2 chapters that I feel most moved by when I read it, reread it even to myself now. This book represents a book that I needed, but couldn't find during my husband's terminal illness, during his death period, and afterwards as I was grieving it. It's a personal story. Several people who have reviewed the book called it a love story, and I guess it is. It's also a self-help book, both for survivors and for people who are going through the dying process. And in a culture that so often ignores this process, it's important that we can be open about it. So what I'd like to do is to begin where one should always begin, which is in the beginning, and read just a little opening segment from the first chapter. The chapter is entitled A Culture in Denial, and I think this little short opening sets the tone for the book and will give you some sense of the book as a whole. And so let me do that first, and then I'd like to read from pieces from 4 other chapters in the book, and then I would be happy to take whatever questions you might have. And let me preface by saying I do not put myself out as an expert on death and grieving. I'm not. I know what I've learned and I know what I've experienced, but in your community, in your churches and in your mental health organizations and with grief counselors and others who are available professionally, they bring an expertise that I don't have. I've got more expertise than I want because it all came through losing people I loved, but I don't ever want you to think that I'm telling you because I've written this book that I'm an expert, but I think I know some things that will help others as they go through these processes. So let me read from this first chapter, as I said, that I believe sets the tone for the book. Can you hear in the back of the room? I'm okay. You know, there's some chairs up here closer if it would be helpful for you to just move up. We'd wait a minute, it would be fine. I want you to be able to hear. Sure. There's several chairs up here and it might make it easier for all of you. Nobody minds waiting, it just takes a minute. You don't mind waiting, do you? Nah. See, I told you they don't mind. Is that a little better maybe? Good. Everybody comfortable? Okay. I stood in the doorway of the large bedroom staring toward the windows, but I did not see the winter trees beyond the glass, the now empty bird feeders in the late sun, or even the dark oak that framed the windows and the window seat in the warm and inviting room. I saw only a single white rose and a sprig of pine in a small vase on the window ledge next to a lovely piece of sculpture. 3 shiny bronze dolphins played and leapt in the metallic waves of the art piece. For a long time I stood looking at the sculpture, imagining the dolphin sounds and sensing their freedom. Then silently, once again, the tears began. This was no ordinary room. It was the bedroom where my husband had died 6 weeks earlier. The sculpture was the urn I had chosen so carefully, a tribute to him and to the sea he loved. I'd placed the urn containing Frank's ashes on the window ledge near the outside bird feeders. When Frank could no longer go outdoors, he had watched the birds from his bed. I'm drawing flies here. The bed where he died was next to his big chair, near the large dresser with the framed family photographs he had requested. His urn was on the window ledge, but I couldn't tell anyone. Frank died on Halloween, and he would be interred on his birthday, December 28th. I brought him home for Thanksgiving and Christmas. Construction workers were finishing a new room at the mausoleum where his remains would be placed in a few more weeks. But especially during this season, I couldn't face the thought of Frank's urn in the dark and lonely mausoleum vault. Frank was home for the holidays, but I couldn't tell anyone. So I stood crying in the lovely big bedroom alone with his ashes, the devastating memories of his death, and my secret life of grieving. And then I did what I did every afternoon. I walked over to his urn, put both hands on this lovely art piece, and said, "Hi, honey, I'm home." In this room, this sanctuary, I could still talk to Frank, report about my day, kiss his photograph, and wrap myself in his robe. Here, holding his urn in my lap, I could tell him how I struggled through each day without him. So I asked myself, if more than 7 years after Frank's death in 1993, is this the story one dare tell to strangers or even friends? Are these the actions of an emotionally stable person? Will people who know me reading this book shake their heads? The answer is, I can't worry about these questions if I'm going to write about the grieving process with any honesty or validity. I cannot hide from public view these uncomfortable stories and be of any real help to people who read this. For it is in the telling of such stories that I begin to free myself from the cultural bondage of appropriate grieving and allowed myself the normal and natural experiences I needed to heal. I do not know who made these rules about appropriateness. I only know they are wrong. When we share our grief stories, we not only free ourselves, but we free our society from the silence and isolation that has long surrounded death and grieving in this country. When my father died unexpectedly in 1990, a friend gave me a wonderful book about loss. To Heal Again by Rusty Burkus is primarily a picture book with bright Japanese-like illustrations and a minimal text. From my first reading of this book, 2 thoughts stayed with me and sustained me. Grief will take as long as it takes, and there's no right way to grieve. There is just your way. When I read these words, it was as if this book gave me permission to grieve in my own time and in my own way. These words imprinted on me, and they have become my belief. Can I get a glass of water? I should have thought of that first. I'm sorry. Now I want to move to chapter 3. It talks about Frank's medical diagnosis and the way it changed our life and obviously changed our future. The chapter brings a real-life focus to the issues of non-denial in times of medical crisis. Thank you very much. I'm sorry. I have something you may never have heard of. It's called environmental asthma. It came from 4 years of living, or 5 years almost, of living in Boston. So the dry weather bothers my breathing apparatus here. I've tried to speak about how important the responsibility is on the part of both the doctor and the patient to face the end-of-life realities openly. And so the name of this chapter is called The Diagnosis and the Choices, and I'd like to read a portion of that to you. In October of 1992, my husband and I sat in the doctor's office waiting for the results of Frank's latest medical tests. This was not a new experience for us. Frank felt good and he was confident about his routine 6-month checkup. Yet each time we faced this waiting with the same trepidation, the same anxiety. Frank was a 4.5-year survivor of prostate cancer. It had not been an easy road. Frank's radiation treatments for cancer had severely damaged his spinal nerve system, and he lost the use of both legs. For the past 4 years, he had dealt with constant pain and 2 dying legs. He could never leave his wheelchair. Being a paraplegic was a tragedy, but surviving advanced cancer for more than 4 years was a gift. Frank rarely complained about the price he paid for his survival. But on this particular day, his gift was to be. The cancer had returned and spread. The doctor told us quietly that Frank's new condition, lung cancer, was terminal. I'm sorry to report that your cancer has spread to your lungs. There's no good news here, Frank. This is a terminal condition. You've got about a year at the most. 1 year. 1 year to live. The room was silent. I took Frank's hand. He squeezed my hand in return. Frank shut his eyes. No one spoke again for what seemed like a very long time. And then the doctor did something I will never understand. He told Frank he would set up an appointment for the following week to begin chemotherapy. Frank and I looked at each other confused. And then Frank asked the 2 questions every patient in his position should ask. Will this treatment extend my life? The doctor answered, yes. And then the second critical question, the one that so often goes unasked. For how long? With some hesitation, the doctor answered, a month maybe, even 6 weeks. If you are familiar with most patients' physical reaction to chemotherapy, you will know it's not a pretty picture. I have watched as the body reacts to this intentional poisoning. Chemotherapy is a harsh treatment. To undergo such treatment to perhaps extend Frank's life by 4 to 6 weeks seemed highly questionable. To undergo chemo would diminish almost all remaining quality of life from an already terminal patient. For Frank, chemotherapy was not a cure. This was not about hope. This was certainly not about reality or kindness. This was and still is a routine medical response to a cancer diagnosis. In most cases, I believe this routine response is often a medical misjudgment encouraged by a culture in denial and a medical profession equally in denial and unwilling to treat death as normal. We are so afraid of death in this culture, so geared toward medical miracles, we lost all sense of perspective. There's nothing wrong with the patient wanting a miracle, a medical miracle. However, we have come to a place where families are demanding miracles when death is imminent, and doctors often play the Wizard of Oz trying to orchestrate false hope and deny reality. There comes a time when the medical community must lay all the information, facts, and options on the table for a dying person to weigh. Then doctors and family members should step aside and defer to the patient's personal judgment and wishes, including the decision to stop treatment and face death on his or her own terms. Frank said no to the treatment. He opted to maintain the most quality of life and the most control possible for the time he had. He never regretted that decision. I want to skip through this next part and just read one paragraph to you. After Frank got his diagnosis, a few weeks after that, we took a trip to Hawaii. We'd been over there many times, and we had not told anyone about his diagnosis. And we went over there to figure out what to do. There's not a lot of books written on step 1, 2, and 3 about when you find out you're dying. And so we went over there together to figure out what to do. When we'd tell people, what we'd tell people, when he'd become public. He was a member of the state senate, and he needed to think about how publicly he wanted to be about this. And so we spent a week over there working through all of the issues that we thought we would face. And so this next little part is just the end that follows the page of that trip. We had begun the work of acceptance. We were determined not to waste any time. Frank was clear he was going to live until he died. Accepting that he was dying gave Frank more space for creating good times, and for those he would leave behind, he created more good memories. We had begun the journey. I would travel with him every step of the way until that was no longer possible. Now, the chapter on hospice, which I can't read today, I hope you'll understand. This is the sort of the next best thing to it. It's a chapter called Caring and Caregiving. And I wrote the chapter partly because I think a lot of readers and a lot of us are really scared and uncertain when we think about caring for someone who's dying. It's a very scary thing. We don't know where to go, and we don't know if we can do it. And I just wanted people to know that if that was their choice, that if they were caring for someone they loved at home, if hospice was part of their choice, I wanted them to have some sense about thinking of themselves in that role, and that it could be a positive opportunity. So this is a very short chapter, and I'll just read a good part of it to you, but it is easier for me to read than the other. For a dying person in the home is a difficult job, a remarkable process. You are tested physically, psychologically, and emotionally, yet those who participate in this process are permanently and positively touched. Many people are convinced they do not have the courage and personal strength required to do such caregiving. They look with awe at those who have chosen the caregiving path and believe that they possess special attributes given to the rest of society. As someone who walked this path, let me assure you, more than courage and strength, the major ingredient for such caregiving is love and patience. You do not be a nurse, a saint, or a hero, just a human being who cares and is willing to ask for help. Now, let me be honest with you. The caregiving responsibility of a loved one who is dying can test the patience of the most among us. Do not begin this act of love without understanding that reality. And do not look back after the death, no matter what the process, and feel as if you have failed. Caregiving for a dying person is both a test of endurance, and a demonstration of love, and no one who assumes this responsibility will come out of it with a perfect record. Life and death are about perfection. You will change beds, prepare food that is never eaten. You will lift the patient when your back aches and give nighttime pain medication when your emotional pain seems as terrible as your loved one's physical pain. Often you will sleep in a chair and eat when you have no appetite. And you will learn intimate details about bodily functions. At the same time, you will be privileged to hear the innermost thoughts of a person facing death. You will talk of love in the middle of the night. You will be there to give and receive comfort from a person who understands the priceless value of time. You will make space for sharing memories and slowly saying goodbye. And if you are lucky, you will be there to see your loved one slip comfortably and serenely into death. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I went to Frank's bed and often found him wide awake. I would ask if he needed something, and he sometimes replied with answers such as, "No, I'm just thinking about my life," or "I was listening to the night," or "I need more time to be certain you're ready for this." I never knew what to expect from him in those quiet night visits. Those were the times when we would share some of our deepest thoughts. One night, Frank told me his concern about my impending loneliness. He thought that I should begin dating immediately after his death. Such a conversation allowed me to assure him I would be fine alone. During those private times, we relived our many sailing adventures and talked of roads we had traveled. We spoke of lovemaking and old friends and grandchildren, joys we'd shared in our 20 years. We touched, held hands, laughed, and asked questions not asked before. Sometimes in the warmth of August and September, Frank asked me to open his windows in the pre-dawn hours. He wanted to listen to the first morning songs of the birds at the feeders and the slight rustle of the trees just outside his bedroom window. How he loved the birds. Until the end, Frank drew tremendous joy and comfort from the birds' songs. More than 7 years later, I still cherish the memories of those weeks. How much I would have missed if Frank had been hospitalized. I might have gone home at the end of visiting hours and missed learning about the night sounds. Now, I'm going to skip over to this next page. I'm going to take another drink of water. I would like you to take a deep breath so that I can get through the last couple of paragraphs. Me. I find it helps if you just take a deep breath, and then I can read this last little piece to you. Okay, I'm going to have one. I think I can do this, but now you'll know why I don't read the hospice chapter anymore. During the last weeks of Frank's life, Frank had been clear to me that he was ready to die. My turn to be brave and give him the permission he seemed to need. As Frank lay dying, surrounded by family, I had to help him let go. Our shared experiences in the final weeks gave me the courage to do so. With several deep breaths, I turned my thoughts to the majestic brown hawks of Oregon. I imagined the hawk in flight, soaring above the fields and hills, dipping and turning, beauty and freedom silhouetted against the sky. Frank loved the brown hawk. He never failed to notice one in flight. And a hawk perched like royalty atop a country split-rail fence post never escaped his watchful gaze. The hawk was pure pleasure for Frank. For our 15th wedding anniversary, I commissioned an artist to carve a lifelike brown hawk for Frank. The small, carved wooden hawk sat on a fence post, rusted barbed wire curled around the post. Frank's special hawk nested on his office desk for 5 years until his death. Kneeling on the bed that last early morning, I summoned all my courage and love and said softly, "It's time to let go, Frank. You can fly like the hawk, float on the air. The whole sky is yours. Be a hawk, Frank. You are free to fly now, my love." I knew Frank heard me and understood. No longer did he need my caregiving. Now he needed me to demonstrate what I had learned in the last months about caring, loving, the night, the birds, and letting go. And he let go and soared. That's the reason for the hawk. I did it. Got through it. I usually get about 5 words to the end, and then I can't read the rest. So now to show you how really brave I am today, and because I didn't read hospice, and I don't want you to think I don't have any courage, I'm going to read a chapter that I don't read every time, and I'd like to share it with you. This chapter is the chapter I almost didn't write because I didn't feel that I had skill enough to take on such an overwhelming subject. But in the end, I couldn't figure out how to leave this discussion about dying and grief out of the book and feel that the book was finished. The chapter is entitled Facing Death, the Misery in the Moment, and it felt like a real challenge as a writer. It felt like an incredible challenge for a first-time author. So let me read this for you, and then I promise we will move on to a grieving chapter that is, I hope, a little easier to deal with. There are some experiences where comprehension does not evolve from reading or hearing about them. Being there is the only way to understand. I have never read a description of a sunset that begins to do justice to the splendor and magnificence of its color and expanse. Standing in the night looking skyward during a snowfall creates a wondrous space and motion that one must experience to truly know. Witnessing the birth and the first cry of a baby always causes me to weep, but I am without words to describe why. For me, witnessing death is the combined experience of sunsets, falling snow, and birth entwined into a soul-altering instant. Like birth, I do not have adequate words to describe those last moments of life or the moment when breathing ends. Perhaps those are life experiences that insist on knowing from the heart rather than the mind. Yet it is essential to give you some sense of that precious experience. For several days it was clear that the end of Frank's life was near. He had not eaten for days, took little water, and was in a coma-like state. There was almost no bodily elimination, and he seldom moved. Frank seemed unaware of the people who watched him closely, and we tended to speak in whispers. He was surrounded by pillows to keep him comfortable and physically supported. Frank looked small and pale in his nest of pillows. An oxygen tube helped him to breathe with more comfort, and his pain medication was by his bedside, but even that seemed called for less and less. Our hospice nurse, Cecilia, was now in constant attendance, and she felt Frank would not survive the next dawn. The morning hours turned to afternoon, and afternoon shadows gave way to darkness. Cecilia, Frank's 2 daughters, my younger son, and 4 other family members held vigil by Frank's bed. We waited and watched. We took turns holding hands and holding Frank's hand. Each glance across his bed spoke volumes about trepidation, weariness, fear, and uncertainty. Quietly, we took turns comforting each other. As one person's courage waned, another one of us found new strength for the difficult vigil. The swish and soft click of the oxygen machine was often the only noticeable sound in the room. As the evening passed, it felt impossible for me to leave Frank's side. For long periods, I knelt on Frank's bed so I could touch him, speak to him, and comfort him. Hearing is the last sense to go for a dying person. I depended on that fact even when my words were unacknowledged. An hour passed, 2 hours, almost 3. My legs were cramped, my back ached, but I was afraid to move. Finally, I had to leave Frank's side to use the bathroom. A wave of panic caught me. How could I leave his side now? What if he died while I was out of the room? I didn't know what to do. We had begun this long trip together, and now only a few steps away from completion. I couldn't be gone at the moment he died. Tears welled in my eyes. What could I do? Then I remembered what hospice had said about a dying person's ability to hear. So I simply told him, Frank, I have to go to the bathroom. I can't wait. I will only be gone for a minute or 2. You cannot die while I am out of the room. I want to be with you. I said it once, twice, 3 times. Frightened, I jumped off the bed and ran to the bathroom and returned almost immediately to his bedside. And then they told me, after 4 days without a word, Frank had spoken my name twice in that brief time that I was out of the room. He had heard me, Frank knew I was there, and he had waited. A little drink again. I bet this is strange on our camera, my bobbing in and out of the camera here. A short time later, Frank began the final phase of his life. Hospice describes this as apnea, which means alterations in the breathing pattern caused largely by decreased circulation. Breathing may not occur for 10 to 30 seconds at a time. I had read the words apnea several times in the hospice material, but the description was meaningless until I witnessed it myself. And I will never forget that experience, never. The first time Frank stopped breathing, we looked at the hospice nurse. She was looking at her watch, then back to Frank. It was 10 to 15 seconds, but it felt like an hour. Then Frank took another breath. Everyone in the room seemed to react. There were sighs and a small smile, a hand removed from a mouth, and then it happened again. This time the lapse between breaths was near to 20 or 25 seconds. My stomach turned with fear. The pattern continued. Was it a half hour, an hour? I don't know, and I have never asked. It seemed like days. Each time his breathing stopped, I wondered if it would begin again. This was a body ready to die, but a human being demonstrating the remarkable value of life, one breath at a time. Each new breath he took felt like a miracle. Frank took another breath. We waited for the now familiar pattern, 10, 20, 30 seconds. We waited for him to breathe again. My eyes left Frank's face to glance at the hospice nurse. She looked at her watch, then our eyes met. She smiled gently, nodded to me, and then walked across the room to shut off the oxygen machine. The silence was deafening. Frank would not breathe again. I reached down and removed his oxygen tube. Then the silence was filled with sobs as we all understood. The meaning of the quiet. Later, I realized that you cannot recognize someone's last breath when it happens. You only know it was the last breath when another does not follow. I would not trade this painful, remarkable human experience for anything. I am so grateful for what Frank gave me, for what hospice helped me to understand and endure, and for learning in the growth I received from each person who was part of the journey. You can see why that is so difficult to describe. Those of you from hospice staffs and those of you who have gone through this experience, it's just a very difficult thing to put onto paper and have it make any sense to someone who has not experienced it. So now I would like to read you my absolute favorite chapter in the book. I don't know whether one can have favorite chapters in such painful discussions, but I have one, and this is it. It was the reason I wrote the book. It started out to be a magazine article about how frustrated I was with how poorly our culture dealt with the grieving process. I noticed today in one of the articles in the newspaper that it talked about how uncomfortable our culture was with the grieving they'd witnessed on the part of the 9/11 survivors. And this is absolutely true. I was so frustrated I was going to write this irate article and get it put in a magazine. But it turned out that I had a lot more to say than I understood. And the magazine article turned into a book. And this was the first chapter I wrote in the book, and it remains my favorite chapter in the book. The chapter is called Permission to be Weird. And it is the grieving chapter, the most important grieving chapter, I think, in the book. I have 100 secrets about grieving. Some people may think my secrets are strange. I do not tell my secrets about grieving to anyone because they might think my secrets are too weird. How do I know they're weird? Because I've heard these judgments about grief and how it is supposed to work hundreds of times throughout my life. And so I have 100 secrets. My secrets are about trying to cope with a huge hole in my life where my husband and others I have loved and lost used to be. My secrets are about trying to hold on while I feel I am sinking. These secrets are my crutches that help me limp through painful days and weeks. My secrets are small pinpoints of color in a gray world of grief, and they are about being weird. I know because they say so. They are the people who judge what is appropriate and inappropriate when grieving. I've heard them say, "Did you know she keeps his urn on the mantle? Isn't that weird?" His wife has been gone for 2 years and he still takes flowers to her grave every weekend. That is really weird. I used her master bathroom at the birthday party and she still has John's slippers sitting in there. Now that's weird. Well, I'll tell you what's weird. She sits in his big chair in the dark and plays his old records. I met a man on a train between Portland, Oregon and Boston, Massachusetts. He had the sleeper compartment across from mine. He was probably in his early 70s, and he was traveling to visit his children. When he introduced himself, I immediately knew. I could see it in his eyes. Grief. But I didn't ask. He was a stranger. When dinner time came, he knocked and asked if I would like to share dinner with him. In the dining car, it took less than 5 minutes to learn that he had been widowed only 4 months. I feel lost and unanchored, he admitted over dinner. I told him my husband had died 1.5 years earlier, and then I just listened. He knew somehow that I was a safe person to talk to. Before long, I knew his wife's name and her favorite color and the name of the disease that killed her. He told me about their home and their children and her funeral. He even talked about the widows who were already pursuing him and how he wasn't ready yet. That is a man's problem, not a woman's problem. He kept telling me how they brought casseroles to him. You know, I've been widowed 9 years and no man's ever brought me a casserole, so it's one of our society's strange things. Please don't bring me casseroles. The next day we shared lunch, and then he told me he had some secrets. Back at his home near Spokane, Washington, in the bedroom they had shared for decades, he had placed a picture of his wife on the dresser. He had surrounded the picture with some of her costume jewelry and sprayed her cologne on the dresser scarf. "I don't want you to think I'm crazy," he explained. "I'm not, am I?" Then he went on to tell me that on their wedding anniversary, it would have been their 48th. He brought her a beautiful bouquet of roses. He put them beside the picture on the scarf that smelled like her. He wished her a happy anniversary, told her he loved her, and then he wept for a long, long time. "Do you think I'm crazy? Is this so weird?" he asked, "that I should be concerned?" "Of course not. You're fine. You're just grieving," I reassured him. "We have to do something to cope with our loss on these special days. It's not weird. It's wonderful." 4 months dead, after more than 4 decades together, a man takes flowers to his wife to commemorate a wedding anniversary and then worries about his sanity and the appropriateness of his expression of love. What is it about our culture that would make him believe that he is acting crazy? In the past few years since Frank's death, I have become part of a secret society, a club of widows and widowers who feel safe to share their stories of loss and mourning and grief and their special secrets. Sometimes that club includes parents who have lost a child, a son grieving for his father, a gay man coping with the death of a 25-year partner. I've heard many secrets from those facing the loss of a loved one, and repeatedly, people will preface their secrets with, "I know this will sound weird." Never before have I been privileged to the secrets of so many wonderful and caring people. I am convinced more than ever that our culture has labeled as weird some of the most wonderful, precious, and sensitive acts of grieving and love imaginable. Now I understand it is imperative to give ourselves permission to grieve in our own time and in our own way. Our culture's label of what is weird and what is appropriate when grieving are hurtful and harmful. We may choose to keep our secrets, but we need not feel strange about choosing our own path for grieving. Or we may decide to tell part of our secrets so that others may learn from them and may know that they are not alone. So I'm going to tell you one of my secrets. It's in the book. It's not a secret now, I guess, if it's in the book, is it? But it was a secret for a long time. This is when you know I'm never running for election again. In the early weeks following Frank's death, I attended a holiday gathering that had been a tradition for us for several years. It was a meal followed by Christmas caroling through the host and hostess's neighborhood. I almost skipped the evening, but I decided it might help me to be outside enjoying the event, an event that Frank had always found so special. So I went. Good food, good company, lots of hugs and sympathy, and a holiday gift I could never have imagined. When the caroling was over and we came back to the house to warm up, a woman I barely knew asked if she could speak to me privately. I agreed. She first told me she had seen my husband's obituary and knew that he had been cremated. And she also knew from a family member that Frank was not to be interred until after Christmas. I told you earlier we interred him on his December 28th birthday. She had become a young widow 8 years earlier. Now she wanted to share with me a suggestion offered to her by an older widow the day following the death of the younger woman's husband. You'll think this is weird, but it may really help you in the time ahead, my new acquaintance explained gently. She suggested that before I place Frank's urn permanently, I remove some of his ashes and put them in a small lidded container that I could keep with me at home. She said, "You'll be glad later that you did this." 2 days later, I returned Frank's urn to the mausoleum, accompanied by a small silver box. I told them what I wanted, and they didn't even flinch. That night, I sat on my bed alone with a large white napkin spread out before me. In the middle of the napkin was the small silver box. I shook it gently, and something rattled, almost like metal on metal, only more subtle. I hesitated, and then I removed the tight lid from the box and looked inside. From that moment on, there was no doubt that these were Frank's remains. On top of the small mound of ashes was a piece of burned wire attached to what appeared to be a small piece of bone. I paused, and then I smiled. Frank had been ill a long time and suffered from years of pain. He had 2 separate pain control mechanisms embedded in his body. They were expensive electronic devices with wires, some attached to the vertebrae in his back. For years, Frank had laughed about selling his body for parts when he died. We kidded him about being the bionic man. And here it was, a small piece of burned wire. I picked it up, examined the wire, and then placed it back in the silver box. My bionic man. This was Frank, or part of him. I touched the ashes gently and then closed the special little box. That silver box with a silver seashell on top has traveled with me across the country. In the early months of grieving, I carried the silver box in my briefcase when I traveled, feeling him close at hand. When I moved east, the silver box traveled with me by train across America. It has been on my bedroom dresser for years. In more than 7 years, it has been opened only 4 times, on 2 wedding anniversaries and on 2 other occasions. I never had an opportunity to thank the woman from the party for my holiday gift in 1993, but it has been a priceless gift. Maybe one day I will not need the silver box anymore. Maybe one day I will spread those ashes on the waters of the San Juan Islands where we sailed together for 20 years, but I'm not ready yet. The silver box and its contents still give me comfort. Sometimes I pick the box up and shake it gently as I walk in or out of the bedroom. I listen to the small sound of metal on metal, and I smile and sigh, and Frank feels closer. There are millions of secrets about grief hidden by those afraid of being judged weird or strange or even worse. In the mausoleum where my husband's ashes rest, a place that felt cold and foreign when my grandparents and father were placed there, years of regular visits have helped me to understand the commonality of grief. Sometimes a new name appears on the marble, and after the first flowers wilt, there's no sign of visitors again, while other crypts tell the story of every family event, and flowers appear weekly. Parents, spouses, sons and daughters, grandchildren, and special friends speak to those who have died. Sometimes they speak out loud. I have heard them. Sometimes they speak with flowers, but it is the other messages that catch my breath or bring me to tears. Balloons and birthday cards, a lace-trimmed handkerchief, the picture of a new grandchild born only weeks after a 46-year-old woman was placed near Frank, a stuffed soft lamb at Easter for a 1-year-old child, and a Batman toy for a 7-year-old on a 2-foot-high Christmas tree. Poems, anniversary cards, news clippings, wedding photos, lipstick marks on marble, apology notes, Valentine's cards, graduation announcements, and love letters speak to the dead. Everyone grieves in their own time and in their own way. I have learned so much about grieving from those messages. People need to reach out and speak to those who have died. I know their need to share with those they love. Death does not end love or need. If our culture thinks this behavior is weird, that it represents instability or wishful thinking or desperation, I would challenge this judgment. This grieving behavior represents love and loss and coping and healing. The mourning is necessary and normal. It is real and it is not rare. People who are grieving have hundreds of secrets. Many of us would like to tell our secrets to others if they would be gentle and understanding and tolerant. We want others to understand how we grieve and how we cope and not judge us. Their acceptance would help us and ease our pain a little. But when all is said and done, people who are grieving do not need permission from others or approval from others. We have given ourselves permission to be weird, to comfort ourselves, and we will heal one secret at a time. Thank you. Thank you very much. I would be happy to answer any questions you might have. We do have books in the other room, and we'd be happy. I'm going to autograph books for people who would like to have that later. But if you have questions now, I would be happy to answer them for you. Yes?
As a caregiver, what helped you the most during this period of death and loss?
What helped me most as a caregiver when I was caring for Frank? Two things I think I would have to say. The first, we had a wonderful friend living with us. I was governor when Frank was dying, and so I had this sort of little job I needed to do on the side. And on top of the fact, let me add, on top of the fact that Frank was dying, my sister had also been diagnosed with what they thought was terminal cancer at the time, my only sibling. And 5 weeks before Frank died, my first husband and my father's children died. So it was like a very, very difficult personal, emotional time. But the two things that helped me most were Arlene, who I write about in the book, who helped me care for him and was there when I couldn't be there. And the other thing, I think, as much as anything, was his openness. His non-denial, his being willing to say that he was dying, the openness with which the two of us could communicate. I don't know whether he caused all of that, whether I caused part of that. I can't tell you why it happened, but there was simply no denial from the beginning. And at some point along the way, Frank said, you know, honey, I've made this interesting sort of understanding about life that has come to me during this period of time, and I waited for this revolution, and it really was a revelation, and it was a revelation. But he said there are only two things that are important in life: love and time. And we shouldn't waste either of them. I thought that was pretty sound. And so what we did was not waste any time pretending that it was going to be different than it was. And his ability to speak frankly about his pending death, I think, helped me as much as anything, because we could be open and honest. And that helped me when I was tired and when I was drained and when I was emotionally worn out. It helped me when I'd like to have been doing a little denial, because it would have felt easier. And it helped me deal with the other people who surrounded us, family and friends who came around and oftentimes had some magazine article about some new cure, or they came in and said, well, I don't believe this diagnosis, Frank. I know you're going to get well. And Frank would say, time out. We don't do that in this house. So I think that openness helped me as much as anything. It really, with his showing that kind of strength, I think it gave me more strength to help him. So That's a good question. So, other questions? I've worn you out. Worn me out. So, yeah. Yes.
Just a comment, Governor. I think it takes a special person to go through what you went through, and to tell the audience here. About the time you had learned of your sister's illness, we here in the county had written to the governor and asked her to join us for the June Dairy Parade. And she wrote back and said she couldn't promise because she just got the word of her sister's illness. The day of the parade, we were down trying to hand cards, and somebody tapped me on the shoulder, and I turned around, there was the governor. She said, "Do you have a card for me and my granddaughter to write in?" She was there.
Yeah, it was, one of the things that's hardest is you have a tendency as a caregiver and a loved one to just want to stop everything. But the truth is you have to keep living because after your loved one is gone, those other relationships and those other responsibilities will still be there. And I didn't want to take time away from Frank, but some of the time I took away really made me a better caregiver. Sometimes you need a rest, you need respite, and one of the wonderful things that hospice does is offer you respite. Somebody who will let you just go to the grocery store or will let you take a walk or will do anything that gives you some space and just gets you out of that setting for a little while is helpful. And so my granddaughter was my respite. Whenever I went any place during that time that was a little bit for fun, which the Tillamook Parade was, I took her because she brought such joy to me. It was a real respite when I got away to do something with her. And so I think you have to look for those places where you can find comfort and relief and a little laughter in your life. And it doesn't mean they can't always be with a person who's dying. Frank gave us his, the hospice chapter, which I didn't read. There's a wonderful line in there after he had a stroke, and when he started talking again, his first real line is in the book, and it gave us laughter and tears for a long time afterwards. So some of that laughter comes, in fact, from the person who's dying and the joy of being with them. But it really is important you get away, and that was one of those days when I got to get away and come to Tillamook County, and I look at that picture now. The other thing I didn't tell you when I was reading is Arlene, who helped me take care of Frank and lived with us in the governor's residence. She right now is in the hospital. She's just had a lung cancer surgery about 16 days ago and is quite ill. And 3 days ago, she had a second surgery. Something went wrong, and they had to do it again. And so, this is the first time I have not been at Providence Hospital for over 2 weeks. And I was feeling really guilty when I came yesterday about being away. I probably need to be away for a couple of days. It'll probably help me to come back and be more useful to her. So it's one of the things we have to remember is how important respite is for caregivers and for loved ones to take a little break. And I think sometimes probably for our loved ones, they're glad to see us gone for a day, Just go away. Isn't that true? yeah, just sort of get off my back and leave me alone. So I think there may be some truth to that. Sometimes we have these people who overcare, and I think, and I do it, so I know, but I think sometimes Frank was really glad when I went to work some morning. God, that woman is on my case again. So, is there anything else I can be useful with or be helpful for you with?
I just need to say how important your book was in the last. Lola's husband and my friend died, 2.5 weeks ago? And we were given the book by hospice, and someone who was here, we adore them.
I understand that.
And it was the weird chapter that gave us permission to do lots of things that we wouldn't have, we probably would have done them.
But you wouldn't have told about them.
And it was such a relief. It was such permission granted to be with that in a way that wasn't hidden.
Well, my publisher is nagging at me right now. She thinks I need to write a second book called Permission to be Weird and take the chapter and publish it again and then tell in the book the stories that I'm getting. You can't believe the stories I'm hearing. They are moving, they are amazing, they are funny. I can't tell you what I've learned from other people who've talked to me about their weird stories. And in Ashland a few months ago, I was there, and I was doing a book signing. People were going through line, and I was saying hello to them, and I was signing the books. And this woman had this kind of little, like a carpet bag. It was like made out of carpet bag material and opened up. It was kind of a big purse, and she opened it up, and she took this jar out, and she says, "This is my Aunt Mary." And I said, "Hello, Aunt Mary." I mean, what can you say? And she said, "I'm taking her to Missouri in 3 more weeks," but she said, she died here, but she's going to be buried there, and they've got her urn there, and I'm taking her back for the burial services later. But she said, "I'm just afraid to leave her at home." She said, "If my house burned down, how could I tell Aunt Mary from the rest of the ashes?" And So, I mean, it was just absolutely priceless. So we had a little discussion about Aunt Mary, but the stories that I have received from people have been so open and so warm and so wonderful, and it makes me a lot less worried about my own weird stories now, and there are lots of them. I talked about the hawk. For a long time, I was embarrassed to tell people that part of the connection that Frank and I have now is this hawk. And I know there are lots of brown hawks in Oregon, and my logic tells me that they're just brown hawks because there are lots of them in Oregon, but they show up in odd places at odd times with me. And so I've started paying a great deal of attention when the brown hawk shows up and I'm someplace. And I told somebody earlier the reason I like to be in Tillamook County is because there's so many brown hawks and I feel like Frank's around me all the time. But the Compassion in Dying organization has received a gift from Florida about 6 months ago. An artist in Florida sent them 25 of these prints, and they're almost the length of the piano, not quite, but almost that 88 key length. They're pretty long, and it's this beautiful red-tailed brown hawk with his wings spread out like this. It's a beautiful, beautiful print. And he said, "I don't know what you can do with these, but if you can use them for fundraising to help the Compassion Dying organization, then use them." And so the director of Compassion Dying called me and said, "Barbara, I want to tell you what we got in a box in the mail yesterday." And he told me about the picture, and I didn't say anything. And he said, "I understand you have a brown hawk story." And I said, "How do you know that, George?" And he said, "Well, I'm not going to tell you how I know it, but I know you have a brown hawk story. I want you to tell it to me." And I said, "George, I can't tell it to you. It makes me cry, and I can't talk about the brown hawk." And so he pushed on me, and I finally told him. We had this teary conversation on the phone. And he said, "Well, I have a request. I want you to write a little 1-page sheet." 3 weeks ago, with a hawk feather given to her by a Native American man. And he said that he found it on the top of a mountain, and that he'd seen the book and knew that she was the publisher and wanted her to have the feather that just like was on, it looks just exactly like this one right on the back of the book. And so she gave me that, and now I have it, but my requirement is that I have to give it away. And so I'm looking for the place to give my hawk feather away, just the right place. So I might take it to my sister died a year and a half ago, and she got the first copy of this book. It's a little weird too, but I autographed it to her because I promised her when she found out I was going to publish it that she'd get the first copy, and so I wrote her a little inscription in the front and wrapped it all in plastic and took it and put it on her headstone in McMinnville, and it stayed there for about 5 months. And then one day I went and it was gone, and my nephews were all upset because the book was gone. I said, "It's okay. Somebody who needs it has it. It's okay not to worry about it." And they said, "What if somebody tries to sell it on eBay?" And I said, "Who cares?" So weird is okay. We just, I just am a lot more comfortable about my weirdness than I used to be. And if I can make everybody who needs to grieve more comfortable about it, it will be a contribution. And what has begun as a magazine article and turned into a book is now a mission. So thank you very much. And I would be happy to sign books if you'd like. Thank you. Thank you. you.